أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله ولا أكبر الله قوة إلا بالله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى سيدنا محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى سيدنا إبراهيم بارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى سيدنا محمد بارك على سيدنا إبراهيم وعلى سيدنا إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري أحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي آمين 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 بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. It is my joy and pleasure to be here today to present to you my research on liberation psychology and directive and non-directive approaches. I'd like to thank the Institute for Muslim Mental Health and the Muslim Mental Health Conference organizers, especially all the volunteers, and to acknowledge as well that this research was a debt to Sabine Sheikh and Dr. Denise Berta, who contributed to some of the critical thinking involved in developing the work. So with that said, without further ado, let me share my screen with you. So my talk today is on liberation psychology and directive and non-directive approaches. My name is Sarah Huxtable Mohr. I work at Larkin Street Youth Services in San Francisco. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this very quickly. So liberation psychology is something that is very talked about right now, especially with the Second American Revolution happening, all of the work that's going on for liberation in the world. It's more and more being talked about, and all the work in decolonial psychology being done. But the work that we're seeing now in liberation psychology really goes back to the 1960s, so liberation theology. So there's some debate on the origins of liberation theology. One theory is as a result of Vatican II and Maryland in South America, liberation theology was developed in South America and Central America, and then spread from there out into the rest of the world. A second theory is that there were convergent streams of thought in response to the attention of the 1960s that gave rise to feminist liberation theology, Black liberation theology, Muslim liberation theology, and other liberation theologies. The basic premise of liberation theology is that historically theology was done to support power and to support the status quo in the interest of the oppressor. And the goal of liberation theology was to do theology in the interest of the oppressed, not the oppressor. So it was a Christian theology based on Catholicism originally in most of its iterations. And the Christology, instead of Jesus in the sky, was finding Jesus in your in the poor, and a soteriology of salvific action of engagement with oppression, and not just sacraments or communion, but actual lived engagement. An eschatology of the end times being ongoing revelation of God's work and love in history towards a just reality, not the rapture and Jesus descending from the sky to change the world in the twinkling of an eye. So those kinds of concepts were the basic framework of liberation theology, and it was centered around a concept called the preferential option for the poor, which first entered the literature of the Catholic Church in those words at Latin American Conference of Bishops at Puebla in 1975. That's when it entered the literature, how it entered the vernacular of the liberation theology movement all through Central and South America long before that. And Dr. Frida Sack, who is the most famous Muslim liberation theologian, who I'm sure many of you know, critical in the work for apartheid, to abolish apartheid in South Africa. As many of you know, I'm sure the Muslim voice and Call to Islam were critical in the work of abolishing apartheid, and Dr. Frida Sack works extensively with the concept of the preferential option for the poor and authentic engagement with the other. And it's oriented primarily around the concept of a God of justice. So rather than a God of judgment or power or authority, hierarchy, it was based on the concept of a God who was a God of justice. So liberation psychology unlike liberation theology, is not debated about having emerged from one strand. There's pretty wide consensus that liberation psychology emerged in simultaneous places around the world in response to the liberation theology movements that had diffused around the planet. So currently, as a result of scholarship in the 1990s, the primary person who most people think of is Ignacio Martin-Barrow. Martin-Barrow was a Jesuit priest in El Salvador who was murdered by a U.S. Street death squad tragically in 1989, as well as his work challenging the oppression of the people of El Salvador. And Martin-Barrow traced his work back to liberation theology in Latin America due to his connection to the Catholic Church. So he was a Jesuit. Martin-Barrow's work, writings on liberation psychology, were published in English in the early 90s, and Noam Chomsky actually presented at the APA convention in the early 90s on Martin-Barrow's work, and it's an ongoing conversation about liberation psychology. But it was not only that Martin-Barrow did this work. Liberation psychology also emerged in Ireland with Geraldine Mooney. Starhawk, the Wiccan priestess in the United States, worked extensively with the concept of liberation psychology. Eduardo Duran worked with the concept of liberation psychology in the Native American community. The concepts of post-colonial psychology are all oriented around liberation psychology. Fanon is quoted by many to be a liberation psychologist. Liberation psychology is oriented universally around some basic premises, the primary one being that psychology should have an explicit goal of establishing justice, social justice, environmental justice, gender justice, racial justice, and not maintaining the status quo. So as part of the goal of doing psychology with the goal of justice, you can see threads that run through all the different liberation psychology thinkers. Some of them are critique of a trans-historical and ahistorical perspective, universalizing and generalizing about people without regard to culture, scientism positive, it can't be tested, it's not real, reproduction of hierarchy and models of dominance endemic to patriarchy, white supremacy, classism, and colonialism, individualism, the individual person can be taken out of the social environment and treated without the context that they lived in. Famous work is being done in Palestine around this, and it's a very intuitive thought. How do you treat a Palestinian who's traumatized by the violence of the Israeli government? Taking them out of the social context and thinking you can give them treatment for depression, in the context of what they're going through socially. The concept that you simply cannot take the person out of the social environment. And one of the things that is important to mention is that in third world countries and in the Southern Hemisphere and the global South, liberation psychology is already widespread and has been used in South Africa. Sadat has been used in Bangladesh. Anasar Rahman has been used in Palestine, Makawi. So is a conversation that's going on in the Muslim world in the global South fairly extensively. So at least as far as I can tell from the literature, never having been there, I don't know, but it seems like in the literature it's very widespread. And obviously that makes sense because taking a Eurocentric paradigm and putting it in a colonial, post-colonial environment is obviously not an intuitive fit for most people. So another thing that was criticized was the concept of hedonism as the innate nature of all beings. People universally seeking pleasure and avoiding pain as their primary motivations in life. So this is based on Freud, Marcuse, the fact that Freud wrote about the concept that people seek pleasure and avoid pain, and the only thing that kind of limits our endless pleasure seeking is the boundaries of other people's endless pleasure seeking. And Martin-Barrow said, and as many other people have said, you simply cannot ascribe all human nature to seeking pleasure. The self-sacrifice of a El Salvadorian peasant in the interest of revolution, or the self-sacrifice of one individual for another individual. This is not purely about pleasure, that people have altruistic motives, people have spiritual motives, and people have higher motives in life beyond just simply, base human desires. And a lot of work on this is obviously echoes works that's being done in the field of Islamic psychology around the construction of the self in historical Islamic psychology, and the fact that this framework prioritizes a Eurocentric view of the human person, scientific, materialistic, epistemic, that disregards a lot of truths that are fairly obvious to a lot of people who don't follow that worldview. So moving on specifically more to my research, collectivism versus individualism is something that I began to focus on in my work on liberation psychology. And by the way, I have a paper on liberation psychology, which you can read more about this. So if you have any questions, you can text me on the WOV app. Collectivism versus individualism was something that I focused in on my work on individualism. Collectivism versus individualism. Me nervous. Collectivism versus individualism is something that I focused in on my work because there is kind of a popular wisdom and to some extent truth that Muslim majority communities and countries emphasize collectivism over individualism more than Western European and white North American culture. This has led to an emphasis on directive approaches in the literature. And I'm sure many of you have heard of it. I've asked this question before. A lot of hands go up. Have you heard that Muslims respond well to directive approaches? There's quite a bit in the literature that Muslims report they prefer directive approaches. However, I had an interest in questioning this for a variety of reasons. And basically, it started out with a question about cultural humility and cultural competency. So cultural competency is kind of an old model from multiculturalism to cultural competency, which is progress from total insensitivity and help providers avoid some blunders, but it was based on belief that you could understand cultures in ways that could apply to members of all groups and had a huge danger of stereotyping. Tervalon and Murray-Garcia came up with a model of cultural humility, self-reflection, and lifelong learning, which involved curiosity and a genuine engagement with people as they are, and being committed to gaining knowledge of other cultures, but understanding intersectionality better than cultural competence tended towards. So this question about collectivism versus individualism, cultural humility, led to a question about directive approaches. So like I said, they're discussed in literature on Muslim mental health is more appropriate for Muslims than other people due to collectivistic natures of Muslims. There's a danger of culturally competent people taking this approach without reflecting on individual needs. So I thought it would be fruitful to discuss potential other avenues of research and investigation. Directive approaches, according to most liberation psychology thinkers, reinforce hierarchy and models of dominance. There's a danger that directive approaches recreate repression in the clinical environment in a way that mirrors and supports cultural oppression. And that therefore with colonized people, it's actually not necessarily the most productive thing to do to direct people to kind of fix their individual problems in an individualistic kind of trans-historical, ahistorical framework, because obviously if there's a social justice problem, understanding that context is more empowering than just isolating the individual. And obviously, so directive approaches are increasingly dangerous for people who've been silenced or erased socially, such as women, LGBTQ individuals, and African Americans, or people of color who have been historically increasingly marginalized. And you know, the conversation about elevating people's voices. Well, if the entire conversation is about elevating people's voices, being directive in therapy is not necessarily really even honoring that dialogue. So my research went toward non-directive approaches, and this is something that Martin Barrow talks about extensively. Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator, and he emphasized dialectical approaches, dialogue, as a way to raise consciousness and engage oppression as an educational approach. So not banking education, where the teacher puts in the information, the student spits it out on test time, but a dialogue, a raising of consciousness. Other non-directive approaches are client-centered approaches such as unconditional positive regard, and was oriented around understanding the impact of societal forces and oppressions on individualism. Societal oppression has the potential to produce depression, anxiety, and psychosis, as well as a variety of other psychological disorders, and that's widely reported in the literature. Martin Barrow, Watkins, and Schulman, but also Fanon talks extensively about this in his work on psychology in his work. So at this point, I really want to again acknowledge Sabine Sheikh and Dr. Denise Berta for their thinking on this. But one of the questions we asked was, if you're taking non-directive approaches, what if you apply the concept that collectivism was super central to Muslim mental health and used group therapy approaches instead of individualistic approaches like one person in a room with one person. It's atomized individual approaches. Try and work from a group approach. So we talked about the fact that there's directive group therapy, which can utilize interventions that could draw from traditional Islamic contexts. This is moms and mimbars or halaqas or iftars, and the importance of cultural alignment between group leaders and participants. Also non-directive group therapy that utilizes collective tendencies such as conscientization, consciousness raising, dialogue, and honors the possibility for emergent knowledge and generative themes, which could really allow people to tap into their ability to relate to other people. And this has been widely documented. Group approaches have been widely documented as highly effective among people who've experienced a lot of stigma, because being in a group environment where you're talking about your mental health challenges with other people who are experiencing the same thing can be very normalizing. And we all know the conversation in Muslim mental health is very oriented around stigma, as it is in all mental health, but particularly in Muslim mental health. So there is quite a bit of research, if you start looking, about the importance of group therapy for overcoming stigma. So the key takeaway is to find new ways of being in the world. Innovative approaches hold possibilities and opportunities for pioneering new forms of practice. If we're going to figure out how to live in a better world, we're going to figure out how to actually make liberation and revolution happen, we need to think outside the box. We need to create new paradigms. The old paradigms are not working. We don't have a new paradigm. We're in a totally new world than we've ever been in before. And we need to be pioneers. That's Fanon's words. We need to be pioneers. We need to create a new human being. We need to figure out who we are and who we can be and what the possibilities are for humanity. Further research is obviously needed, including the impact of societal oppression and psychological disorders. It's important to raise awareness due to both individual variation and multiple outgroup memberships that assuming Muslims respond better to directive approaches could lead to poor clinical outcomes. Engaging in psychology with the goal of creating a more just world requires supporting people's consciousness. Simple thought. If you want to create justice, support people's consciousness, because the power of the people is going to transform the world. So to nurse that light, to fan that flame is a possibility for psychologists, for Muslim mental health workers. Clinical approaches that support empowerment, self-expression, agency are particularly appropriate for women and LGBT. And finally, group therapy as a form of intervention is under research and developed as a way to incorporate cultural emphasis on the group due to collectivism and holds promise that needs to be explored. Thank you again to Sabine Sheikh and Dr. Mies Berta, the Institute of Muslim Mental Health, and the organizers of the Muslim Mental Health Conference, especially Dr. Farah Abbasi, Dr. Hamada Hamid, and Mary Fadowsi, the Center for Islamic Studies, the Graduate Theological Union, especially Dr. Munir Jua, and finally, Larkin Street Youth Services for supporting this work. I really appreciate all of you for coming to my talk. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Be well, stay healthy in the midst of all of the chaos, and I hope to see you in other talks soon. Take care. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.